Hey everyone, my name is Kelsey and welcome to my channel. And on this channel we are going to be discussing true crime cases. I'll be going into backstory on some of the famous killers that we know today and what sick and twisted things they've done to get that title. I do though want to start off by giving just a brief warning that today's story is going to be a very disturbing one, to say the least. If you aren't going to be able to continue this video with me, I do completely understand, and hopefully I will catch you in the next video. But today we are going to be discussing Ed Gein, and he was also known as the Butcher of Plainfield. You may have heard of him. If not, I am going to be diving into his life story, giving a little details on his childhood, his adulthood, and unfortunately, some of the crimes he would go on to commit later in his life. Now, with the research that I did find, I also was able to look into in his life, and the crimes he would go on to commit would also be inspiration for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill, and Norman Bates. And if you're like me, I have seen the movies, I have seen the show, and I knew that they were based off true events to an extent, but I did not know who the inspiration came from. So that's just a little bit more information in case you didn't know that as well. But to get a better idea of who Ed Gein was, in my opinion, it is best to start from the beginning. He was born to Augusta and George Gein on August 27th, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His mother, Augusta, was said to be a domineering woman who was strict, overbearing, and very religious. She would preach to Ed and his brother Henry about the evils of the world and the immorality of women from the time they were just very young children. I can understand as a mom myself wanting to, prepare your kids for the world, because, unfortunately the world is not always kind to us. So I do understand wanting to, have them ready to just kind of get some of that criticism and stuff that they're eventually going to catch. But in my opinion, I do think that Augusta would take that too far. And not to mention, just from the time they were kids, she would also portray women as sinners and harlots. And obviously, though, those preachings did not apply to her. In her mind, anything exciting, slightly fun, or even normal was sinful. And it's just really sad to think these kids were raised thinking that living any type of normal life was a major sin, and they would go on to be punished for it. Ed's father, George, from what I could find, he really wasn't much better, honestly. He did own a local grocery store in town, but he would go on to sell that grocery store in 1915 before they would move into the farmhouse. And this would be the same farmhouse where Ed Gein's gruesome crimes would go on to take place as well. It was said, though, that George would take his frustrations out on his family, that he was abusive and an alcoholic who left all the responsibilities on Augusta. It was also reported that he spent most of the family's money on alcohol. As parents, we are supposed to be role models for our children growing up. And unfortunately for Ed and his brother, this would not be the case for them. Although their parents would play a great role in what Ed Gein would go on to do later in his life. Now, I am going to jump a little bit into their childhood right here. Ed and Henry lived pretty sheltered lives growing up. Ed was bullied a lot due to his lazy eye and his speech impediment, which made social events or having friends impossible. And unfortunately, we all know how cruel and mean kids can be. And it didn't help that, Augusta would also preach to her kids how friends would bring sin into their lives. I mean, she kept them so isolated and just fearful of the whole world around them. The thought of their mother not allowing them to have any friends or even just be a typical kid is honestly heartbreaking. As kids, that bond with friends, is something that helps us grow in just so many different ways. And honestly, Ed's father, George, wasn't really around much as they were growing up. And Ed said from what he remembers, the times his father was around, they weren't very good times. His father was abusive to him and his brother physically. It was also stated by a few different sources that when Ed was younger, he would sneak into a room on the farmhouse and he would watch his mother hang a pig up in a room on the farm and slaughter it. Ed would say that it gave him a feeling he had never felt before. he felt, aroused and also confused by his body's reaction to what he had saw. It was said that he would go on to have an orgasm. I definitely think, though, this would show how sick and twisted Ed's mind was, and about when all of this started for him, kind of what age this would start for him. But as Ed got older, into adulthood, his relationship with his mother became more of an obsession. Wasn't like most mother-son relationships you would see today. Ed would spend a lot of his time trying to appease his mother, just trying to be exactly who she was molding him into being. George's father, Ed's father, George, would go on to pass away at the age of 66 from heart failure in 1940. Ed and his brother would go around town looking for odd jobs, just trying to find ways to help with living expenses. With their father gone now, they had to become the men of the house. It was said that Ed would babysit some of the local children in the area. I thought this was rather odd, though, just considering how isolated his mother kept him. But it was said that, he would get along with children, better than he would the adults. Henry would go on to end up meeting a divorced woman. He fell in love with her. They had plans to move in together, get married, and start their lives. Obviously, their mother, Augusta, she wasn't very happy when she heard this news. She preached to Ed how Henry brought sin onto their family, how Henry embarrassed her, and Henry would also become concerned with Ed's relationship with their mother. He knew it wasn't a normal one. Henry would try to talk Ed into going out, meeting new people, forming new relationships, just trying to get him to, live his own life. But Ed was so caught up in his mother's beliefs that he didn't want anything to do with Henry's views on the world, and not to mention their mother was telling Ed how Henry embarrassed her, and he didn't want to be like Henry. He didn't want to do that to his mom. But, I feel like we got to give Henry credit here. He was trying to give Ed some kind of normalcy. Augusta really wasn't trying to do that for him. He broke free from his mother, and he just wanted Ed to be able to have that chance to actually experience life, to see that their mother's preachings and her views on the world weren't exactly as she said they were. He just wanted Henry to be able to have freedom, just have friends, have some kind of normalcy in his life. Sadly, though, Henry would go on to pass away in 1944. It was stated that Ed and Henry were burning vegetation on the farm, and the fire got out of control. Now, the fire department would be called out to help assist with putting the fire out, and Ed would go on to report Henry missing to the fire department. And apparently, from Ed's report, Henry ended up disappearing during the time that the fire got out of control. Now, it was said that they would go on to form a search party, and, they would go on to find Henry, and unfortunately, he would be lying face down on the ground. It was said that he died from heart failure, but it would later on be officially reported as asphyxiation. And I know that I butchered that word. Please bear with me. If you can't tell, words are hard for me right now. But they would also go on to find bruises on Henry's head, which did raise questions about foul play. If he died from asphyxiation, then he shouldn't have bruises on his head. And this is where you think, officers would go on to do a full investigation, just considering there was even just a small possibility of foul play. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case. It was rumored amongst the people in town that Ed killed Henry, but there was no actual proof of that. I really feel like, though, they should have investigated this further. I wonder if anyone regretted not looking more into this with what we would go on to learn about Ed later on. In 1944, shortly after Henry had passed, Augusta would have her first stroke. Ed would become her sole caretaker. You would think Augusta would be grateful she had someone to help care for her, but let's be real here. It honestly didn't change a thing. She was still verbally abusive to Ed, telling him he was worthless and he wouldn't be able to go on without her. She would still preach on the evils of the world and how women were harlots and trick him into sin. Augusta must have really thought she was something special, though. It wasn't until his mother's second stroke that would cause her to pass in 1945. And that moment would change Ed into something much worse than honestly any of us could have thought. He was lonely living on that farm by himself. It turns out that, his mother was right. He couldn't handle life without her. And his obsession with her would, take over in ways that would end up disturbing so many people today, and unfortunately would be the start of many horror films today. Ed said he would go on to hear his mother's voice after she had passed, still telling him how to live life and what was right and wrong. Still beating her strong religious beliefs in Ed's head. It was like he'd heard her preachings for, so long that he lost connection within himself at times. It was also said that, he would go through the house and close off some of the rooms in the house that his mother would use most. He wouldn't even change anything about these rooms. He would leave, everything exactly the way she had it. Almost like, he was trying to keep a shrine of her, of who she was still in the home. And now we are going to be getting into some of the crimes, Ed would go on to commit in his life. Not long after the passing of his mother, unfortunately, Ed, would go on to become a grave robber. And yes, unfortunately, I did say that right. But not exactly the kind that you were probably thinking of. He wouldn't take, any of the belongings that were buried with these bodies. You know how, when some people pass, their loved ones would bury, their favorite necklaces, or their scarves, or pictures, or write even little notes and stick it down in the caskets with them. And, he wouldn't take any of that. Instead, he would just take the bodies with no graveyard attendants or, cameras. This for Ed was like a dream come true. He would go between 3 different graveyards for these bodies. Ed would only dig up graves that were freshly buried. And when I say freshly buried, the ones with all of the fresh dirt still on top. It would definitely make it easier for Ed to get away with taking the bodies. If you honestly think about it, who's really going to question a freshly buried grave to wonder if the body's still going to be inside the casket? Ed did have a type of body that he would look for. He would look for women who were middle-aged and resembled his mother. I couldn't imagine, though, going to my loved one's grave only to find out later on that the body was missing, just to, be found at someone's house and used to fulfill their sick and deranged morbid fantasies. After this case, honestly, I'll never be able to look at graves the same again. That's for sure. And I will go on to get a little bit more into what he would do with these bodies at this point. He believes these bodies would give him the sense his mother was still with him. I'm not sure, though, how you would think taking bodies from graves would, give you the comfort or the sense that your mother was back home with you. But, in Ed's sick mind, that's how he saw it. He would see these bodies around the house, and his mom would act out, visions of them being his mother, like actual hallucinations of her rocking in her rocking chair, just speaking to Ed as if she was sitting right there beside him. And, this is where it would go in, again, that obsession with his mother, still thinking she was still with him, seeing her, hearing her, things like that. She really had a hold on Ed's mind, though. She made it to where he had to be completely dependent on her in every way. It's like every action he did or thought that crossed his mind would revolve around his, mother's opinion or approval. It's really crazy, though, to see the hold she had on him. Even in death, she just had him completely brainwashed. Once Ed got the bodies to his house, he would go on to use the skin from the bodies to make some disturbing changes to his furniture. He would use the skin to upholster the furniture in his home. He would take the seat covers off the chairs and use the skin in place of the seat covers. It was even said he stitched someone's face to a chair. Could you just imagine, walking into someone's living room, looking around, trying to find a place to sit, and seeing an actual face stitched to someone's chair? It's crazy to see how he would use these bodies with his furniture, just the things he would go on to do with them. Ed even thought using skin to upholster his lampshade was a great idea. So he would use the skin to cover around the middle frame of the lampshade, and then he would just put it back on the lamp and use it as a regular lamp again. Can I just say, though, I'm honestly glad he didn't take up interior decorating. He was a very sick individual. Unfortunately, though, it only gets worse from here. Now, it was mentioned that he was questioned in 1953 about the disappearance of a local 15-year-old girl in his town. Her name was Evelyn Hartley, and she would go missing one night while babysitting. Ed would be cleared, though, as a suspect due to passing 2 polygraph tests, and they didn't find any evidence that tied him to her disappearance. So, unfortunately, with nothing to hold against him, they let him go, and her case went cold, and still to this day, it has not been solved. I just couldn't imagine, though, being her mother, her father, or just anyone that was close to her, hearing that she had went missing during a night of babysitting, something I'm sure that she had probably done multiple times in the past. I'm a mom myself, and it's honestly just truly heartbreaking, and my heart goes out to her family, and hopefully they do go on to find, eventually something that leads them on to discovering what happened with her. So I am going to go on into Ed's murder cases. His first murder would take place on December 8th, 1954. Mary Hogan, the owner of a local tavern in town, would cross paths with Ed that night, and unfortunately, she would never be seen again. The only thing left behind would be a pool of blood. It was rumored that Ed would make jokes that Mary was staying over at his house. Although a lot of people in town overlooked Ed's comments, I wonder if any of them would go on to regret this later, especially after finding out what Ed was capable of. They just couldn't see Ed doing something like this, but little did they know how truly sick and twisted he was. It's always the ones everyone is likely to least expect that end up becoming these deranged killers. Someone did report seeing Ed's truck pull up and saw Ed go inside the tavern, but after speaking to Ed, they wouldn't have anything that would tie him to her disappearance, so the case would go cold. He was off the radars for now, but we all know it wouldn't be for long. Ed's second murder would take place on November 16, 1957. Frank Warden, a sheriff's deputy, would stop by to see his mother, Bernice Warden, the owner of a local hardware store, on that day. When Frank got to the store, he saw the back door was left open, the front door was unlocked, and his mother was nowhere to be found. Frank could tell something wasn't right. His mother was a widow. She wasn't known for leaving the store unlocked or even unattended. As Frank would continue to look through the store, he then noticed in front of the register was a trail of blood leading out to the exit of the store. Frank would go on to look around where the blood was found, and as he checked the register, he would come across a receipt for half a gallon of antifreeze, and it would be written out to no one other than Ed Gein. Thank God, back in this time, they did actually have a way to track cash payments. I wish that's something that we still had, till this day in age and time, but unfortunately, that's not something that anyone really does anymore. But this would be a blessing in disguise. Without that receipt, who knows if they would have honestly ever been able to tie Ed to Bernice's disappearance. Frank would go on to notify officers, and from here, they would go on to discover much more. So they would go on to Ed's farm, and after arriving there, a few officers would go on to do just a little search on the property, and unfortunately come across Bernice Warden's body behind the house in what was known as a summer kitchen. She was strung up naked, hanging by her feet, and her head was nowhere to be seen. This makes me go back to when Ed saw his mother, strung that pig up, and if Ed was maybe trying to reenact that with Bernice, almost like he was wanting to feel that sensation all over again. She had been cut from her pelvic area all the way straight down to her chest. Again, she was hanging upside down. Ed had removed her organs and left the rest of her body to drain. Officers were just so horrified with what they saw, they had to call for more backup. They didn't know what to expect after seeing what happened to Bernice. They only went there to talk to Ed, to just take a quick look around. They weren't, honestly expecting to walk into that horrific murder scene. But once the other officers would go on to arrive at the farm, they would go on to do a full search on the property. And what they would go on to find from this point would be even more disturbing. and would later be given the name Ed's House of Horrors. It's truly sad, though, to see what all they go on to discover with, these bodies and what all Ed would go on to do to them. But after exploring, the rest of the farm, they would also go on to discover a box containing 9 preserved noses. It wasn't mentioned, what he had planned to do with those noses. All we know is that he did have a sick obsession with human skin and body parts. And this would truly, though, in my opinion, give the saying, "I've got your nose," a whole new meaning. I mean, who just keeps a box of 9 preserved noses just laying around their house? But they would also discover women's preserved vulvas. And the faces of the victims were just peeled off the skulls and stuck to the walls like wallpaper. Could you imagine walking into someone's house and what is supposed to be wallpaper is just full human faces just stuck to the walls? A trash can and several other chairs were upholstered in human skin. There was also a belt film that had women's nipples stitched on it. And I'm not exactly sure, again, what Ed had in mind for that belt, but he definitely gave a new meaning to the word bedazzled. He even had bowls made from human skulls. It was said that he would use these bowls for soup bowls. And just when these officers, were thinking that nothing else could shock them, they would come across a suit. But not just any normal suit. It was made from the skin of a female torso. He also made leggings from the skin off the legs from the bodies he had taken from the graves. And he would, put on that skin from the torso just like, he was putting on a shirt. And he would slip into those leggings, and he would even take a face that he had peeled from another body and put it on like he was wearing a mask. And, he would just walk around in that suit at night pretending to be a woman. But, I mean, not just any woman, though. He would pretend to be his mother. And for me, looking at all of that, I think this is truly where Ed's obsession with his mother would really come to light. It was almost, for me, as I was reading this and searching it, almost like he wanted to be her in every sense that he possibly could. Give the suit, go on to what he would do with the bodies, how he would, look for certain bodies that, resembled his mom. It was even said, though, that he found a human heart on the stove. Surprisingly, there was no evidence that he ate any of the body parts or the organs. He did have a very morbid and strange obsession, again, with human skin and body parts, if we couldn't already tell. They did eventually come across Bernice's head in a burlap bag. Ed had put nails in her head, in her ears, and he said that he was going to hang her head up on the wall for decoration. This guy really took DIY to a whole new level. It was rumored that Ed engaged in necrophiliac behaviors with these bodies, but there was no actual proof of that. And Ed would go on to speak up this rumor and said he couldn't due to the smell of the bodies. So he could handle, killing women, digging bodies up, skinning the bodies, taking their organs out. But the smell of the bodies disgusted him. Not to mention he kept these bodies that he dug up in the house for days, if not longer. I'm sure they had awful smells. That just honestly blows my mind. I'm glad he wouldn't go on to do anything, necrophiliac behavior-wise with these bodies. That would, obviously just make him even more deranged than what we would go on to find out, today. But after all these discoveries, they would end up arresting Ed, where he would go on to confess to the murder of Bernice Worden. Ed stated that she reminded him of his mother. Ed would go on to be found unfit, though, to stand trial due to his mental state in the murder of Bernice. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia shortly after, though, being arrested. It was obvious Ed had some kind of mental disorder. He was sent to a mental hospital, and after serving a decade in that mental hospital, he would finally be found fit to stand trial. After seeing the evidence and hearing what all had taken place on that farm, Ed would just be found guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden, though. Even though Ed would go on to confess to murdering Mary Hogan, he was not actually found guilty of her murder, though. And they said that it was due to his mental state in general. But they would instead, though, find him legally insane and sent him to a psychiatric institution for the criminally insane. Now, Ed would, go on spending the rest of his life locked up there, and he would would go on to pass away on July 26th, 1984, at just the age of 77. This case was definitely a heavy one, to say the least. It's crazy to think that after all the evidence that was found, along with Ed's confessions, that these victims didn't really receive any real justice. I mean, Ed literally spoke out and said, hey, I did this to these women and these bodies, and it was just kind of overlooked due to that insanity, or not plea, but due to that insanity verdict that they would give him. He should have, though, in my opinion, still been held accountable for what he had done to Mary Bernice and to the bodies he dug up. They were all someone's loved one. I mean, that has to count for something. I know mental health disorders were not looked into as much as they are today, but I still feel like more could have been done for these victims. I feel like our justice system, lets down so many people anymore. Even though Ed would go on to be locked up, and there would be comfort found in that, for the rest of his life. But, I mean, I still feel like he was let off too easy with what he had done. I would love to hear your all's opinions, though, and your thoughts of Ed and his crimes down below in the comments. Also, if you have, any suggestions on who you would like to cover, who you would like to see me cover next, also list those down below as well. I will be reading through the comments, things like that. And I hope you all loved today's video. I hope that you all will continue to stick around with me and follow along with me. And I do want to thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart for just watching today's video and hanging out with me. It really means more to me than you all will ever know. And again, thank you for your time. I really appreciate each of you. And hopefully I will see you all in the next video. Bye.